Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. Good afternoon and welcome to Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, Chapter Universitas Indonesia, World in a Snap Webinar 2, a new nuclear arms race, China nuclear ambition in the context of the new START Treaty extension. First of all, let us bring our praise to the Almighty God for His blessings and guidance so that we can gather here to attend today's event. My name is Dennis Tahar from the Research and Analysis Division of FPCI Chapter A Board of 2021, and I will be acting as Master of Ceremony of today's event. Before I start our event, I would like to remind all the participants today to rename your Zoom display name with the format of name/institution, and please keep your microphone off during the event. However, you are expected to turn on your camera to pay respect to the speakers. Next, we would like to welcome and express our gratitude to the Board of Executives, Tasya Asila Ramadina as the President, Istia Fadlati as the Vice President of Human Resource and Substance, and Marfela Felicien as the Vice President of Public Relations and Affairs of FPCI Chapter OE Board of 2021. We would also like to welcome the speakers, moderators, and all participants of FPCI Chapter OE World in a Snap Webinar 2, a new nuclear arms race, China nuclear ambition in the context of the new START Treaty extension. In today's event, we are pleased to have Professor Chedamir Nestorovic, Professor of Geopolitics at ASEC Business School, Singapore, Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Mr. Theodorus Satrio Nugroho, Diplomat and Minister Counselor at Indonesia Embassy in Washington, D.C., and Mr. Ali Abdullah Wibisono, PhD, Lecturer at the Department of International Relations, Universitas Indonesia, as the speakers of today's webinar, who will be delivering many insights regarding China nuclear ambition in the context of the extension of the new START Treaty. We are also pleased to have Ka Angelo Abil Wijaya as the moderator of today's webinar. FPCI Chapter OE World in a Snap is an infographic designed by the Research and Analysis Division of FPCI Chapter OE. This infographic contains a summary on recent foreign policy and international issues, which are posted on our Instagram page at FPCI OE. Due to the success of the previous editions of WIN's webinar and a high interest on foreign policy studies among our audience, FPCI Chapter OE decides to hold another World in a Snap webinar, which is open for students, academicians, researchers, and the general public who are interested in foreign policy. I will remind the participant to be actively involved in the discussion as well as raise questions because at the end of the session, there will be a nomination for Best Participant. We encourage you to raise your question to the speakers because we will be judging the best participant candidate based on the most relevant and interesting question. So please do not hesitate to raise your question and be actively involved in the discussion. Before we start the main session, let me explain today's rundown. First is the opening by the MC. Second is remarks from the project officer and president of FPCI Chapter OE Board of 2021. Third is the presentation from the International Conference of FPCI Chapter OE MUN 2021. Fourth is the profile introduction of the moderator. Fifth is the profile introduction of the speakers by the moderator. Sixth is keynote speech by Professor Chedamir Nestorovic. 7, presentation by Dr. Malcolm Davis. 8, presentation by Mr. Theodorus Satrio Nugroho. 9, presentation by Mr. Ali Abdullah Wibisono. 10, question and answer session. 11, concluding remarks from the moderator. 12, best participant announcement and photo session. And last but not least, closing by the MC. Without further ado, please welcome Vianney Wido Putranto as the project officer of this event who will be delivering his opening remarks. For Wido, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for the time. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope we are in all of our best health today. It is a great honor for me to be given the opportunity to hold today's World in a Snap webinar. With the theme, A New Nuclear Arms Race, China's Nuclear Ambition in the Context of the New START Treaty Extension. Firstly, I would like to welcome and thank you all to our wonderful participants here today for your willingness to attend and willingness to learn. I would also like to welcome all of our wonderful speakers today, Professor Chedamir Nestorovic, Dr. Malcolm Davis, Mr. Theodorus Satrio Nugroho, and Dr. Ali Wibisono. Thank you for your willingness to share your knowledge and expertise in this topic with all of us today. Last but not least, I would also like to welcome and thank Mr. Angelo Abdul Wijaya, who will be our moderator for this discussion. Next, my most sincere gratitude goes to Kak Asil, Kak Tia, and Kak Vela as the Board of Executives of FPCI Chapter UI Board of 2021, as well as Kak Evelyn, Kak Rifa, and Kak Joseph as the Manager and Vice Managers of the Research and Analysis Division for all your guidance and support during the preparation of this webinar. In these dire times, we tend to focus all of our thoughts, efforts, and energy into one thing and one thing only, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. It is reasonable and logical, given that this global pandemic has unfortunately reshaped our entire lives in ways that we did not expect a year ago. However, it is also turning our attention away from the significant events that are unfolding around us. One of them, chiefly today's theme, is the rising tensions between the United States and China. Now, some of you might ask, why would we, sitting probably thousands of kilometers away from Beijing, Washington, D.C., or Moscow, pay attention to this particular issue? Well, we all know that both China and Russia are regional powers and trying to emerge on the global stage. Especially in recent years, China specifically has gained political and economic influence, and growth has staggered the world, very quickly catching up to that of the United States. This has made the United States and its allies concerned, and with that, they have tried to mitigate China's rise. This topic is often considered a high-level discussion among academians and students alike due to its complicated, controversial, and multi-layered I hope through today's webinar, we can get a bigger picture, we can comprehend the situation, and we can understand the various perspectives on this issue. All in all, I highly hope that we can all enjoy this webinar and gain insights to build up our knowledge on this issue. Thank you, everyone. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti Om. Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, Chapter Universitas Indonesia, thrive with intelligence.
Thank you very much, Wido, for the opening remarks. Next, we are inviting Tasha Asila Ramadina as the President of FPCI Chapter UI Board of 2021, who will be delivering her opening remarks. For Kak Tasha Asila, the time is yours.
Thank you, Dennis. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, Chapter Universitas Indonesia. This is our second World in a Snap webinar edition in 2021. It's a pleasure to arrange this webinar with our honorable speakers, Professor Sedomir, Dr. Malcolm, Bapak Theodorus, Bapak Ali, and also our moderator, Kak Angelo. Thank you for your time during this weekend. I also want to say thank you to Fian, Rafi, and RNA Division for all your hard work. For almost 6 years, FPCI Chapter A has served as an independent foreign policy community to spread the knowledge related about international issues to Indonesian people. Our members are coming from several study backgrounds that will have different perspectives and make this organization rich of ideas. At first, I thought this topic that has been chosen for the second edition of WIN's webinar is not very common for Indonesian people, but after seeing the participants today, I think I was wrong. I got many questions from several people who are very excited to attend this webinar. Talking about the superpower countries such as US, Russia, and China will never bring an end to our discussion. Every agreement that they made will bring impacts to other countries, especially Indonesia. Is the extension of the New START Treaty will make the world safer, or would it be the opposite? President Biden has made clear that the New START Treaty extension is only the beginning to their efforts addressing 21st century security challenges. Well, however, let's listen to our speaker's opinion about this. Last but not least, let's pray together for the hard situation that we are facing during this pandemic. I know it's not easy for us. I hope the world will get better really soon. That's all from me. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti Om. FPCI Chapter A Board of 2021, thrive with intelligence.
Thank you, Kak Tasha Asila, for the opening remarks. Before introducing our esteemed moderator, I would like to invite a couple colleagues of mine, Kak Asha Devinka and Kenzi Rivantia, to give a brief presentation on an upcoming FPCI Chapter UI event, the International Conference of FPCI Chapter UI MUN 2021. For Kak Asha and Kenzi, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, MC, for the opportunity. Is my screen visible right now?
Yes, it's visible, Kenzi.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin today's webinar, allow us to introduce you to one of the most prestigious events that will be held by FPCI Chapter Universitas Indonesia, which is the International Conference of FPCI Chapter UI MUN 2021. My name is Kenzi Rifantia, and I'm here as the Deputy Secretary General of this exciting event. So, for those of you who did not know already, Model United Nations is a simulation of a UN conference where participants take on the role of delegates from countries all around the world as they discuss and find solutions for various international issues. This year, FPCI Chapter UI will hold its second annual MUN with hopes to improve participants' skills in public speaking and diplomacy, as well as their awareness on various international issues. We will be holding this grand theme, which is Integrate the World, Strengthening Global Cooperation for Sustainable Peace. We base this theme upon Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG number 16, which is Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions. So we will have 4 distinct and unique councils for delegates to participate in, each with their own unique and relevant topic. The first is the Disarmament and International Security Committee, or DISEC, which will have the topic Reviewing the Disarmament, Demobilization, and Reintegration, or DDR process. The second is the United Nations Human Rights Council, or UNHRC, which will have the topic Protecting Human Rights Amidst Political Crisis. The third is the United Nations Children's Emergency Fund, or UNICEF, which will have the topic Ensuring Children's Rights and Safety in Cyberspace. And last but not least, we will have ECOSOC, which will have the topic Guidelines for a Post-Pandemic Recovery Strategy. The main event of FPCI Chapter MUN will be held on 17 to 19 September 2021. It will be held entirely online through Zoom Cloud meetings, which is an unfortunate arrangement that we have to comply to, but we can assure that all delegates will have a wonderful and memorable experience as if this is an offline MUN. So if you are interested in signing up, we have good news because the regular registration phase for FPCI Chapter MUN is now open until 29 August. Tickets are available for an affordable price. For Indonesian delegates, it will be 99,000 rupiah, and for international delegates, it will be on 12 euro with a $2 PayPal fee already included. So don't miss out and register yourself today for the International Conference of FPCI Chapter MUN 2021. Also, don't forget to follow our social media for further information, updates, and other fun stuff, mainly on our Instagram at fpciue.mun. With that being said, we sincerely await your presence at our event to use your voice and make a difference. Thank you very much for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. The International Conference of FPCI Chapter MUN 2021, Pursuing Peace, Seeking Justice.
Thank you, Kenzi, for the presentation. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's event. Our discussion today will be moderated by Mr. Angelo Abel Wijaya. Mr. Angelo himself is an alumnus of Universitas Gadjah Mada, where in 2019, he received his Bachelor of Arts degree in International Relations. He also received the Most Outstanding Student Award in 2018. Mr. Angelo is currently a corporate governance consultant at the International Finance Corporation. Furthermore, he is one of the Indonesian delegates of the Y20 Summit 2021 in Milan, Italy. Without further ado, please welcome Mr. Angelo Abel Wijaya.
Thank you, Dennis. Selamat siang, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be here with all of you today to moderate today's event. As introduced, my name is Angelo, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Before we proceed to the next session, I will introduce the background and the credentials of our keynote speaker. We are very pleased today to welcome Professor Chidomir Nestorovic to be here with us in our event today. And he will be delivering the keynote speech for today's event. Professor Nesarovic is a renowned professor of geopolitics at ESSEC Business School, Singapore, and he is also the director of ESSEC Asia Pacific MBA program in Singapore, and also the academic co-director of the MBA program at the Arabian Gulf University in Manama, Bahrain. Professor Nesarovic received his DEA at the Institut d'études politiques, or what is also known as SIONSPO, where he studied the USSR and Eastern Europe, and he also obtained his PhD in geopolitics from the same school. Without further ado, Professor Nesarovic, the time is yours.
Okay, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so we are just starting by asking, I think that for the last 2 years, can you hear me has become a leitmotif for all professors, for all the students, because this is the first sentence that we have. I'm very happy to be with you today, and I would like to thank also the organizers of the conference, of the panel, for inviting me. And it is really my pleasure, especially when I'm looking at the title of the panel, which is quite exciting. Talking about the nuclear race and including China is not an easy thing, especially in the times that we have today. So I was very happy to participate and was very happy to give my contribution to this. Another thing which is also quite interesting is the fact that I am a professor in a business school. Usually when we talk about geopolitics or international relations, you have people coming from the institutes of international relations or coming from the public school policy, etc. But within the business schools, we are also talking about geopolitics, and I will also give a few words about this a little bit later on. For today, with the organizers, we have agreed on this topic, which is a general topic, which is called Asia as a global and economic axis of the world in the 21st century. As you know, I think that it started at the end of the last century when everybody was predicting that the 21st century will be the Asian century. And it will be the Asian century for many things, especially when we refer to the economic situation in Asia, and that there would be a primacy coming from Asia over the other continents. So that was the atmosphere at the end of the last century. And this is something that we are bringing also today here. So in order to address this, we have two terms. So we have the term geopolitical and we have the term economic. So I will start with the first one concerning the geopolitical. So for the geopolitical, the problem that we have is that we don't have a clear definition about what does it mean geopolitics. And second thing is that usually it revolves around three things. The first one is the space or geography. The second one is the state. And the third one is the power. So these are three things that we have there. And pertaining to something that we are going to talk about later on, when we talk about the nuclear race, we are definitely talking about power. So in that case, it will be one part of the hard power along the conventional power that we have, for instance, concerning tanks, concerning aircraft, concerning submarines, etc. You also have the arms race. The second thing, which is the state, in that case, we talk about one state, which is China, as opposed to the others. So the problem is to know what are the other states that we are opposing to. Is it only the neighbors or is it the distant countries? So this is something that we can elaborate on. And the last thing is geography. And the geography is very important concerning the location of the country. And if we talk about the nuclear race, there would be also a question concerning the positioning of the warheads. From where will the missiles come from? Is it something which is mobile? That is, that you are putting on submarines or that you are putting on trucks and you are moving from one place to the other? Or are they immobile? So in that case, we have silos. And in that case, you are acting from the silos in order to reach a certain target. The third thing that I would like to mention concerning geopolitics is that it can be cooperation and it can be rivalry. So the term rivalry is not something which is compulsory. We can live in peace. And I hope that everyone on this panel would share this. So it is not something which is unavoidable. It is not something which is unstoppable. Cooperation can exist. And for years, it has existed, at least for the last years in Asia before the election of President Trump. So maybe we can go back to this later on. If it is a rivalry, and let's take this case. If it is a rivalry between 2 or 3 countries, the rivalry can be according to several natures. One nature can be ideological nature. And we used to have this with the Cold War between Soviet Union and the United States. Today, we don't have it anymore because there is no alternative which is given to the something that Fukuyama has called the end of history. So in that case, there is no ideological war, or it is not as important as it used to be. The second thing is the political one. So in that case, we talk about political systems. And in political systems, there is a huge differentiation between Asia and, let's say, the so-called Western countries, where in Western countries, we put very much emphasis on the process. In Asia, in some Asian countries, they are putting very much emphasis on the result. So in that case, the result is explaining, and the result is justifying some means that in Western countries will not be accepted. So in that case, the political systems, even if in both cases we talk about democracy, the structure of the political system and the methods that we are using there are not the same. It can be cultural, so I will not refer to Huntington's word. It can be religious one. So there is a huge variety of rivalries that can exist. And among them, we have the military one. So this is something that we are going to talk about. So the military one is not the only one. It is not the only rivalry that can exist. However, in the world that we have today, it is a significant one. So this is why you were absolutely right to have this kind of discussion for today when we are talking about the nuclear situation or the nuclear race. So when we talk about the let's say the military situation, and if we compare 2 countries, that is, we have the United States on one side and we have China on the other side, I recommend you to go and visit one website which is called the Global Firepower. So the Global Firepower is giving the capacity for all countries in the world when it comes to the military means that they have. So you can compare Indonesia to Malaysia, you can compare Indonesia to Australia, you can compare Philippines to China, whatever. You can compare 2 countries, and here I put 2 countries together, the United States and China, and you can see that there is a kind of discrepancy. On one side, we have elements which are going for the supremacy of the United States, and we have also criteria according to which China is superior to the United States. But all this is when we are talking about the conventional power, and within the conventional power, we have one element which is not indicated here, which is the bringing the possibility of having warfare to another place. And how can you bring your capacity to another place? Usually it is done by the Navy. And here we have a clear domination of the United States, especially in one segment, which is the aircraft carriers. For the aircraft carriers, currently, we have 11 of them for the United States. We have 2 of them for China, and they have just started with the 3rd one. So there is still huge disbalance between the United States and China on the other side. And maybe you have noticed that the aircraft carrier, one of the two aircraft carriers from the United Kingdom, is right now in the South China Sea, and it is causing a certain reaction coming from China. When it is the subject of the nuclear race, I will not spoil what the other discussants are going to talk about, just to mention that we have a very big let's say, differentiation between the two big countries, that is the United States and Russia. They have practically the same number of warheads, about 7,000 of them, while the other countries are very small compared to them. For China, we don't have a complete and real, reliable figure, but everybody is saying that it is around 250 or 270. So it is very small compared to the others. However, in the future discussion for today, we can talk about the relative importance of these 250 or 270 warheads that they have there. I will finish with the economic dimension of it, because I'm coming from the business school, and the economic dimension is very important when we are looking at Asia, because during the Obama administration, the stance of the United States was to say, we have to pivot to Asia. Maybe you remember this term, pivot to Asia. And everybody was excited in this part of the world because they were saying, finally, the United States will not only look at Japan and Korea, and they will also look at the other countries that exist here. So this pivot to Asia did not materialize with Trump. He forgot about this, or he didn't want to engage in this. And there were many hopes that with Joe Biden, there would be a comeback to pivot to Asia. Joe Biden was the vice president of Obama. So people were expecting that there would be a continuation of the policy that we used to have 5 years ago when Obama was president. We have to wait and see what is happening. For the moment, the United States is extremely concerned with the developments that we have with China on several fronts. It can be on the economic front, it can be on the diplomatic front, it can be on the economic front. So there is, to some extent, a continuation of Trump's policy, meaning we didn't see a very big change from the election of Joe Biden. So maybe he didn't have enough time, maybe he doesn't want to change. So let's wait to see a little bit what will happen there. But from the economic point of view, these are the two biggest countries here. So I will just skip a certain number of slides here. So just to mention what is the relative size of the different countries. You have two options how to measure the GDP of countries. Either you are using the official exchange rate, either you are using the purchasing power parity. If you are using the official exchange rate, this is what is happening. The United States is the country number 1, and China is the country number 2. If we are using the purchasing power parity, in that case, China is number 1, and the United States is number 2. So whatever the indicator that you are using, you have the two elephants. You have the United States and you have China. No other country can approach them for the near future. So we have to live with this. And all the countries will have to define what is the position. Because today, contrary to the situation 5 years ago, when there was a very strong commitment to cooperation. And at that time, the Americans and the Chinese were calling each other partners. Today, the term partner doesn't appear in any official statement coming from the United States or from China. What we have is competition, what we have is rivalry, but we don't have the term partner anymore. So if they are not partners anymore, it means that the probability of some kind of conflict. It can be economic, it can be political, even sometimes military. The probability is quite high. So it means that the other countries that live here in Southeast Asia or Asia as a whole feel the pressure. And this pressure is that maybe they will have to choose. Either they go with the United States or they go with China. Having an equidistant position, meaning satisfying both sides, becomes more and more problematic. It could be done in the past, but today, 2021, there would be, according to me, many pressures coming from both countries in order to push countries to choose their sides. And when they push them to choose their sides, this is not good. This is not good for the two big countries, and this is not good for the countries here in Southeast Asia, because for them, it is vital to have a good cooperation with both countries, especially from the economic point of view, because we had this attempt of the Trans-Pacific Partnership during the year of Obama. Trump pulled out of this. So now we have the comprehensive one, that is another economic partnership, but the two big countries, China and the United States, are not part of it. So we are waiting that they are becoming part of it, and maybe at that time we can talk about fruitful cooperation. I will just finish here because I don't want to exceed the time, in order to mention again that the rivalry or the competition doesn't mean that we automatically have a conflict. It can be cooperation. So I would like that the two giants, but also the other countries, have this in mind, that this is not something which is wishful thinking to have a cooperation, but it's something that could be beneficial for all, even if at this moment that we are speaking about, you have this demands for having, let's say, a military, or to have a strong approach towards international relations, rather than a win-win, or rather than to have a peaceful cooperation. I will stop here, but if necessary, I will also participate in the debate later on, if you allow me to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. It was a very interesting and insightful presentation. You outlined the dynamics of great power relations in the past 5-10 years, and how the risk and opportunities of the dynamics of these two players in international relations could have impacts to the world, and the risk and opportunities that arise in the next 5, 10, 25 years. That being said, we will enter the panel discussion. The panel discussion, and our next speaker is Dr. Malcolm Davis. He is a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or what is known as ASPI, since 2016. Dr. Davis received his master's degree in military strategic studies at the Australian National University and received his PhD in 2003 from University of Hull. Previously, Dr. Davis was an assistant professor and postdoctoral research fellow in China-Western Relations at Bond University, and he was the Assistant Director of Strategic External Relations and Education at the Australian Department of Defence. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Davis.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I will now start endeavouring to share the screen. This is always the tricky bit. Yes, and we want that. Share. And go to that. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me on board, and thank you for Professor Sedamir for his great introduction. I want to dive deeper into the actual aspects of where China's going with its nuclear forces, and consider where that's taking us in terms of China's nuclear ambitions and how that plays into the emerging strategic competition between China and the United States. and also consider the potential implications for arms race over the next few years. So let me cut to the key issues. We are seeing a significant expansion of China's nuclear forces. It's happening very quickly, and it's started reasonably recently. There's been modernization that's been underway for some time, but we're now starting to see the first beginnings of expansion alongside that modernization. The question on everyone's minds is, how big will that expansion be? How big will they go in terms of the number of nuclear warheads they have, the number of missile capabilities they develop, and where will those forces be? And what's prompting China's apparent expansion of its nuclear forces? What's driving this? We're clearly in a period of strategic competition between the US and China that I think will intensify in coming years. I don't see it going back to cooperation at all. So we have to think in terms of how the strategic dynamics and the geopolitical dynamics play out in the broader Indo-Pacific, where China is clearly challenging the United States' strategic primacy and seeking to revise the international order, so to establish a Chinese-led regional order for certainty, and also to have a more influential role within the broader global international system. And the nuclear dimension of this military modernization that's currently underway in China is really important because it raises a number of interesting questions. Firstly, is China seeking to shift from no first use, which it has traditionally, people saying we can't see Dr. Malcolm's full PowerPoint presentation. Can everyone see my presentation?
I think what they meant is that they didn't see it full screen.
Okay. Well,
I can see. Thanks, Prof.
Okay, I'll keep going. So the key question is it prompting a shift away from no first use, which has been China's traditional nuclear posture, to a counterforce stance? And if it goes to a counterforce stance, that has some fairly significant implications in terms of the number of warheads and the number of delivery systems that China is pursuing and likely to pursue in the next few years. Is this part of a rush to nuclear parity with the United States and Russia? As the previous speaker indicated, yes, the US and Russia both have a significant superiority in the number of warheads and delivery vehicles, but as I'll explore, as you start to look at China's military modernization and its nuclear modernization, there are suggestions, there are indicators that maybe it is closing the gap in terms of delivery systems and also potentially warheads. And is it really about ensuring strategic resilience? If China does see the potential for increasing military conflict on the horizon, and I think everyone in the Australian strategic policy community is concerned about where China is heading in terms of its intentions towards Taiwan, then now is the time it would be seeking to boost its strategic resilience to make sure that it has credible nuclear deterrent forces that can be survivable. So I'll explore all of these things and then move into a discussion on whether arms control with China is even likely or even possible. Right at the moment, all the indicators are that it's not possible. But what happens once it achieves strategic parity, if indeed that is the goal, is another question. And finally, how we respond to that major expansion and modernization of China's nuclear forces is important. How we maintain stable deterrence, particularly in a triangular relationship between the United States, Russia, and China, becomes really challenging because bilateral deterrence is much more easy to do than trilateral deterrence. So let me quickly go through the nature of the modernization that's been underway. Modernization has certainly been underway for some time. When you look at how China have been developing their ICBM capabilities, they've been focusing very much on more advanced solid fuel ICBMs. They've moved from the old DF-5 through to the introduction of the DF-31AG and now approaching operational deployment of the DF-41. The DF-41, I think, is really significant because it's a solid fuel missile, it's road mobile, and it's MIRV capable. It can take multiple warheads. And once that enters service, that opens up the prospect for a significant expansion in China's nuclear capabilities in terms of the number of warheads and the number of ICBMs. China has also been modernizing its older DF-5 missiles, moving them to the DF-5B that can carry multiple independent re-entry vehicles. At the same time, it's developing the DF-26 intermediate range ballistic missile. These are dual role, so they can carry both conventional and nuclear warheads, and they're dual role also in the sense that the conventional version can strike either land targets or against ship-based missiles. And we are moving forward with the slides here. I'm watching the chat here as well. It's also developing sea-based. It's also developing a sea-based ballistic missile submarine leg with Type 94 Jin class. These will be ultimately replaced by the more advanced Type 96, which will have a more advanced missile, the JL3, which has a greater range. But even so, the range of that system will be such that the Type 96 will need to be deployed out into the Central Pacific if it wants to cover targets in the United States.
Dr. Davis, I'm sorry to cut you here, but I think the participants can't see the slides moving forward. We're still stuck on the first slide.
I'm moving the slides forward. So this is my third slide I'm on.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're still stuck on slide 1. Do you probably want to try to stop sharing it and try to share that? Yeah.
Okay.
Let's try that.
Let's try that. All right. Stop sharing. Okay. Let's try that again. Share screen. Hang on a second. I'm getting multiple screens here. Okay. Share. Can everyone see the slides moving now?
Not yet. Do you perhaps want the?
I would just talk to the slides. Okay, let me just talk to the slides rather than going through them. So getting back to where I was in terms of Chinese nuclear modernization, I covered the ICBMs, where China is expanding and modernizing its ICBM force. I talked about the ballistic missile submarines, how China is modernizing its ballistic missile submarine force with the move from the Type 94 to the Type 96, which will have longer range missiles. Probably one of the most interesting aspects, I think, is also the Air Force, where China is developing its own strategic air combat capabilities with more advanced bombers, which can carry air-launched ballistic missiles. And is also developing a space-based missile early warning system in cooperation with Russia that would make sense if China is going to move towards a counterforce capability. The most significant development in recent days, however, has been the discovery of new Icbm Fields in the Yunnan Gansu region, which suggests a significant expansion of China's nuclear arsenal in terms of the number of ICBM silos that are being developed. And more recently, we've seen a second field being established near Hami. Both of these are in the Xinjiang region of China. And there's also been a number of silos being established in the Jialantai training area. So what we're seeing with these new fields is I've just lost what we're seeing with these. Hang on a sec, someone's messing with my slides now.
Dr. Davis, I think the committee is trying to help you with displaying the slides.
Okay, well, I've now lost the slide I was looking at. Let me simply talk to my PowerPoint slides and I'll ignore the Zoom aspect. So the significance of these ICBM fields are that what we're seeing is the potential for China to dramatically expand its nuclear arsenal. I think the implications of this is that China is clearly moving towards a triadic structure in terms of its delivery systems, ICBMs, submarine-based ballistic missiles, and bombers, in the same way that the US has that capability. But they're also likely to expand the number of warheads that they have, moving from the low 200s in terms of operationally deployed weapons 320 warheads as of June 2021 in terms of the total stockpile, potentially much higher. The US DoD suggested in 2019 that China is at least likely to double the size of its nuclear stockpile through to 2021. And in early 2021, the DoD suggests that China is well ahead of the pace necessary to double their stockpile by the end of the 2020s or even greater. And there's some suggestion that it could triple or quadruple the size of its nuclear weapons capabilities. So when we look at the development of those new Icbm fields, that would tend to fit with this suggested expansion of Chinese nuclear capacity. So it does suggest that they're moving not just from modernization, they're actually doing expansion as well. Hans Christensen of the Federation of American Scientists suggested that if the new silos that have been discovered in Uimagansu and more recently in Hami are all located with single warhead ICBMs, then that could see an increase from 185 warheads to as many as 415 warheads by 2030. If the new silos are loaded with the MERVed version of the DF-41, then Chinese ICBMs could potentially carry more than 875 warheads. So we're then getting to the situation whereby China is breaking out of its traditional minimum deterrent posture and its traditional no first use doctrine. So why are they doing this? Clearly, the suggestion is here that China could be moving away from no first use. It could be moving towards a launch on warning posture. And once again, I go back to Taiwan. If China is anticipating military conflict over Taiwan in the next few years, then having a more ready and credible nuclear deterrence posture actually makes it more difficult for the US in a crisis or in a war to strike at Chinese targets on the mainland. The risk, of course, in moving to that posture is that it risks the potential risk of inadvertent escalation, given the entanglement of co-located nuclear and conventional missile capabilities that the Chinese have. So there is a risk in moving away from that no first use posture and moving away from minimum deterrent towards a launch on warning posture based on ICBMs. There is a greater risk of inadvertent escalation across the nuclear threshold in a future conflict. At the same time, it could potentially allow the Chinese to move towards a counterforce strategy, which would then imply continued expansion of its nuclear forces. So all of this does raise questions about how strong that no force use posture is in real war, in a war situation versus what they say during peacetime. Second point I would make in terms of why they're doing this is clearly they are moving towards ensuring a survivable second strike capability. And that ties in with the requirement for greater deterrence credibility through expanding their ICBM leg of their triad. But also they're thinking very much in terms of how US ballistic missile defense capability is evolving. How can the Chinese ensure that their nuclear forces will actually be able to penetrate and strike at targets in a crisis? And so having a greater number of missiles, a greater number of warheads contributes to this. I think also that the Chinese may be thinking about the Russian and Indian nuclear modernization. They can't ignore that, particularly given Chinese-Indian nuclear tensions. And they also are probably thinking very much in terms of how counter-space systems, the potential for an ability to strike at targets in space, and also hypersonic weapons will play a role in shaping their nuclear thinking, particularly given the fact that China and Russia are currently ahead of the United States in terms of both counter-space systems and hypersonic weapons capabilities. So are we seeing a rush to parity, and what does this imply for arms control? Certainly China could move to rush to parity, in other words, try to build up the number of missiles and warheads so that they're much closer in size and posture to the US and Russia. But they need to substantially expand their fissile material production to do this. And they would need to accelerate the introduction of the latest delivery systems, in particular the ICBMs, modernize their ballistic missile submarine force and expand their nuclear bomber capability. So I suppose time will tell as to whether this actually is a rush to parity or it's more about a survivable deterrent in anticipation of a crisis coming in the next few years. But any move on the part of the Chinese to expand their nuclear posture would certainly generate suspicions that China is moving away from no first use towards a launch on warning posture. And that's going to generate a lot of tensions between Washington and Beijing. I think there are concerns also about the DF-26, their intermediate range ballistic missile, as to whether that implies an alternative regional nuclear posture for regional employment with that particular system. Maybe the DF-26 does imply that no first use may be a little bit weaker in relation to Japan or US forces in the Western Pacific. But certainly getting to parity in the next few years with US and China would be challenging, but it does open up some possibilities then for arms control. And let's finish with arms control. The New START agreement has been extended by the Biden administration through to 2026. There's very little prospect for further arms control between the US and Russia, given the tensions between US and Russia at the moment, and also the uncertainty going into the 2024 presidential election. So I think New START is the only game in town. And the question as to whether we try to bring China into a trilateral arms control approach before 2026, when New START expires, is the key one. China has made it clear that it has no interest in undertaking nuclear arms control or any arms control for that matter. And so it's a real challenge getting Beijing to even talk about arms control. They seem focused almost exclusively on military modernization and expansion of their capabilities rather than actually sitting down and saying, well, what can we do in terms of arms control? That has to raise legitimate questions about their intentions in terms of their nuclear forces and their consideration for use. And that brings me back to Taiwan and the prospect for a military crisis in the next few years over Taiwan. If China is anticipating that crisis, they're certainly not going to be engaging in arms control that would actually weaken their ability to ensure credible deterrence. At the same time, any discussion about arms control involving China becomes incredibly complex because it's not just trilateral, it's multilateral. In the sense that China is not only watching the United States and Russia, but they're also watching India. And India is watching China, and China is thinking about Japan and South Korea and whether they will move away from their current posture in terms of not having nuclear weapons, particularly if US extended nuclear deterrence were to weaken in the future. So it's really complex. I do not see a clear likelihood that China will join any arms control agreement going forward to 2026. I think it's more likely that China will maintain a focus on nuclear modernization, on potentially nuclear expansion, and preparing for the risk of a major power conflict in our region sometime in this decade over Taiwan. And I will finish at that point with 5 minutes left. And sorry about the mix-up of the slides. Clearly the Zoom sharing thing just failed completely.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis, for your presentation. Dr. Davis started his presentation with the outline of China's nuclear ambition and the possibility of a New START treaty. And he also shifted the discussion a little bit into how China's nuclear ambition is a reflection of China's global power projection and how it wants to influence the geopolitics of today's world. And one of the most interesting thing that Dr. Davis mentioned was also the fact that the United States, along with other players in the region or in the world, wants China to be included in the negotiating table to have a trilateral treaty, the New START treaty between the US, Russia, and China. But that is definitely a challenge. That is a complex challenge to actually bring China into an arms control treaty, especially taking into account the dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region, especially with the rise of India, Japan, South Korea, as well as Taiwan. So with that, we'll conclude the presentation from Dr. Davis first, and we'll move on to the next speaker. And our next speaker is Mr. Theodoros Satrio Nugroho. Mr. Nugroho is a diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Indonesia. He was a minister counselor at the Indonesian Embassy in Washington, D.C., the United States of America. Previously, Mr. Nugroho was also the Deputy Director at the Directorate of North American Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Indonesia. Mr. Nugroho received his bachelor's degree from Universitas Gadjah Mada and his master's degree in international relations from Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Without further ado, Mr. Theodoros Satrio Nugroho, the time is yours. Selamat sore, Pak.
Thank you, Moderator. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon to all participants and all the speakers and keynote speakers at the webinar organized by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, Chapter University of Indonesia. I know Pak Ambassador Dino Patijalal. I think he is still the president of FPCI. And I admire Ambassador Dino because I think he is one of the creme de la creme Indonesian diplomat. Please, to committee of FPCI, to send my best regard to Pak Dino. To warm up the webinar, I will start with a joke about a diplomat. So what's similarity between a duck and a diplomat? A duck can walk, can swim, even fly, but not good at one particular thing. So it's like a diplomat. He or she knows almost everything, but not an expert in one field. That's my first disclaimer. So another disclaimer that this is not a joke. This presentation is all about my personal views. So I'm not representing Kementerian Luar Negeri. So please, next slide, please. Okay. So how do we predict the future? So I believe almost all of us have the same sense that it is more difficult now than before to make a good prediction, because the COVID-19 pandemic teaches us that even an advanced medical science cannot predict when this pandemic will end. And more that the world now changing very fast, so it's more difficult to analyze the future. But anyway, we should be optimistic that humans through the scientific method can make predictions in order to anticipate what we should do or we shouldn't do, so that world can become a better place to live for us and our next generation. I remember Professor Yuval Noah Harari. I think all of us know him. He is one of the most popular gurus for international leaders. One of his books is 21 Lessons for 21st Century. And he stated in one interview about how about the future. He said that nobody knows how the world would look like in 2050, except that they will be different from today. However, he predicts that there are three trends that threaten the world, namely climate change, nuclear war, and technological disruption. Next slide, please. So, if I may, I will talk more about the nuclear. If I may show you the basic info related to nuclear weapons, it will help us to know how the world manages nuclear mass destruction. So we know that it's different between the nuclear weapons and conventional weapons, because the capacity of WMD is can kill or to harm significant population. And I think after the world seeing the enormous devastation of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as several countries being able to produce nuclear bombs with more sophisticated destructive power, the world realized the need for setting up regulations on atomic bombs to nuclear war. So there are some regulation. First, about NPT, non-proliferation of treaty. So nowadays, 192 states already signed and or ratified the NPT. So signed means that government approve an international agreement, and ratified means that the parliament gives the approval of the agreement. And 5 countries are US, Russia, the UK, France, and China recognize that they have built and tested nuclear explosive device before January 1st, 1967. And 4 countries, which are India, Pakistan, North Korea withdrawal from NPT in 2003, and Israel are known or believed to possess nuclear weapons. So NPT not only talk about regulate about proliferation, but they have the other 2 pillars are disarmament and the right of peacefully using nuclear technology. The second regulation is International Atomic Energy Agency. Its functions is to encourage the development of the peaceful application of nuclear energy. It has another role as kind of the watchdog to provide international safeguards against misuse of nuclear technology and nuclear material. So in the case of Iran, we know that IAEA is Moscow when Iran was considered uncooperative regarding the procurement of the fusion process for the manufacture of nuclear material. The third one is about regulation is nuclear test ban. So after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev realized that they had come dangerously close to nuclear war. The 2 nations carried out various negotiations, and finally on July 25th, 1963, they agreed on limited nuclear test ban that banned nuclear testing in the atmosphere, in space, and underwater. And that treaty in 1969, the UN General Assembly adopted called the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which bans all nuclear explosions in all environments. And as of February 2021, 185 states have signed and 170 states have ratified the treaty. And more regulations about the nuclear weapon is between the US and Russia, formerly the USSR, because the 2 countries that have the largest nuclear warheads. Estimated as of in 2020, there are nearly 13,500 nuclear warheads, and it means that more than 90% belongs to the US and Russia. So they started negotiation on SALT, stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, in 1969, and signed 2 documents. One is the interim agreement, regulate on the ICBM, not only ICBM, but also the new ICBM silos, and significantly increase the size of existing ICBM silos. And also regulate about submarine launched ballistic missile. And the second document is about ABM, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which barred the 2 countries from deploying defense against strategic ballistic missiles. And in SALT, and then SALT 2 took place from 72 until 79. Both parties agreed on banning new missile program and limiting the number of, this is very technical, MIRV, stands for Multiple Independently Targetable Reentry Vehicles. And also they regulate on the long-range missile. although SALT II resulted in an agreement in 1979, but the US Senate did not ratify the treaty in response to the Soviet war in Afghanistan. So the Soviet did the same. They did not ratify it. So the agreement, the SALT II, expired on December 31st, 1985, and was not renewed. So, and then emerged Mikhail Gorbachev as head of the government of the Soviet Union. He is like a game changer in which Gorbachev pushed for the acceleration of reducing the threat of nuclear war. So President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev signed a treaty, namely Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, in 1987. The INF required the two countries to eliminate all ground-launched missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. In total, around 2,692 missiles were eliminated. However, there is a shift in US policy towards nuclear weapons. The US formally suspended the INF Treaty in February 2019, and Russia did so on the following day in response. So the US formally withdrew from the INF Treaty in August 2019. However, the signing of INF Treaty accelerated talks for the START. This is the new negotiation, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. So there are also two START. START 1 signed in 1991. It was a large and complex treaty and led to reducing about 80% of strategic nuclear weapons at that time. START 1 also regulated data exchange of strategic weapons and facilities and inspections. So, START 1 expired in December 2009. And then continued with START 2 was signed in 1993, which established a limit to strategic weapons by reducing their amount. It was to implement it in two phases. Phase 1, to reduce total deployed strategic nuclear warheads to 3,800 till 4,250. And by the end of phase 2, reducing to 3,000 to 3,500. However, the treaty never entered into effect. It was ratified by the US Senate in January 1996 and by Russia in April 2000. But Russia withdrew from the treaty in June 2002 in response to US withdrawal from the FPCI treaty. So US first withdrew the FPCI treaty, and Russia response for the START 1. So both of the states continue with another treaty called Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty. SORT was in force from June 2003 until February 2011, when it was replaced by New START. Under SORT, both parties agreed to limit their nuclear arsenal to between 1,700 and until to 2,200 operationally deployed warheads each. And then the new one, called New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START. That's signed in 2009, is still in effect. In 2009, US President Barack Obama and Russian President Dmitry Medvedev signed New START, a follow-up to START 1, which START 1 expired in December 2009. New START limits the two parties to 1,550 deployed nuclear warheads, 700 deployed ICBMs, deployed submarine-launched ballistic missile, and deployed nuclear-capable bombers, and 800 total deployed and non-deployed launchers. It also provides for the inspection and data sharing on each other's nuclear arsenals that had been lost when START 1 expired in 2009. New START is working, and it's imperative that Russia and the United States start negotiations for a follow-on agreement that continues decades of cooperation on nuclear arms reduction. Next, please. This slide shows the countries with nuclear weapons and the number of nuclear warheads. But like the negotiation between the US and Russia before USSR, nuclear weapons as a deterrent are not only about number of nuclear warheads, but also the explosive yield. So the amount of energy released when a nuclear weapon detonates. For example, the W-88 warheads deployed on Trident II submarine launch missile have an estimated yield of 475 kilotons, compared to the estimated bomb drop on Hiroshima is around 12 or 13 kiloton. Number two, explosive number two is about the estimate of its missile's range. This is about the range, how the missile can reach the target, and also the accuracy of the missile. And number four is delivery methods. Next, please. It's about the possibility of World War III. Since nuclear weapons were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world has never had a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons, even though the total number and explosive yield of nuclear weapons grew rapidly. In my opinion, there are two factors that cause this phenomenon. First is the doctrine of MAD, mutually assured destruction. It's a doctrine of military strategy and national security policy in which the use of nuclear weapons on a full scale by two or more opposing sides would cause the complete annihilation of both attacker and the defender. In US-Soviet relations during the Cold War, MAD was able to keep both sides rational, not to provoke the opposing party to use nuclear weapons. So MAD requires a balance of power for both parties. The existence of inequality can encourage one party to take steps that can be judged by the opposing party as a provocation to the use of nuclear weapons. So, for example, the Cuban crisis of 1962 is because the inequality proves that the inequality of power can provoke a nuclear war. The Soviets considered the US to have threatened its territory by placing nuclear weapons in Turkey. Plus, US allies in Britain and France had nuclear weapons. So to strike balance, the Soviets discreetly placed nuclear weapons in Cuba that could reach US territory. At the time, intercontinental ballistic technology has not been developed optimally. Due to high distrust, the USSR move was considered as a declaration of war. By the way, the Cuban crisis ended with a new balance. The Soviets withdrew the nuclear bombs from Cuba, and the US withdrew the nuclear bombs placed in Turkey. Number two, I think it's not scientific, but I put miracle factor. The world would have disappeared without these three men. First, Gorbachev, with a good faith, wanted to reduce the threat of nuclear war by pushing the US to agree to a significant elimination of nuclear weapons. The US was willing to do so because the US believed that Gorbachev had no hidden agenda. When using political calculations, Gorbachev's move was very unusual because at the time he was not in a condition that required taking the policy. So he kind of an angel, Gorbachev. Number two, this is the real angel, I think. The second miracle is, the name is Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov. He was Soviet flotilla commander and second in command of the submarine B-59. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vasily was assigned to sail with B-59 submarine armed with a mobile nuclear bomb into Cuba. At the time, President Kennedy set a quarantine. Actually, it was a blockade as a U.S. move to show U.S. readiness to fight against the Soviets. But the President Kennedy still didn't want to go too far in provoking Soviets, so he used a softer word, quarantine, for the sea and above area around Cuba. So short story, submarine B-59 was trying to enter the quarantine area. The U.S. military detected the Soviet submarine and forced by military means to expel the submarine. At that time, 3 senior officers on the submarine were given full authority to use nuclear weapons. At the same time, communication between submarine and the headquarters didn't work. So it's already 2 senior officers have agreed to use nuclear weapons in response to U.S. military provocations. However, Arkhipov refused and chose to turn the submarine back to the Soviet Union. Had Arkhipov agreed to fight back by firing nuclear weapons, certainly such an attack likely would have caused a major global thermonuclear response. And then the third miracle, again, Russian, Stanislav Petrov. He was a lieutenant colonel of the Soviet Air Defense Forces. On 26 September 1983, Petrov was the duty officer at the command center for the OKO nuclear early warning system. At the time, US-Soviet relations were tense because 3 weeks before, there was an accident that the Soviet military had shot down a Korean commercial flight. At that time, Petrov was on duty. The system reported that a missile had been launched from the United States. Not only 1, but followed by up to 5 more, which it was estimated that the missiles carrying the nuclear bomb would explode in Soviet territory in 15 or 20 minutes. Fortunately, Petrov judged the reports to be a false alarm, and his decision was not to act and wait to confirm that it was a system error. Petrov's decision was against Soviet military protocol. Fortunately, because of his decision, prevented a retaliatory nuclear attack on the US and its NATO allies that could have resulted in a large-scale nuclear war. Finally, an investigation later confirmed that the decision of Petrov was right. The Soviet satellite warning system had indeed malfunctioned. So when using the scientific method, miracles cannot be counted as something scientific. But there is a theory we call the Black Swan theory, developed by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. It can count as a significant factor. In short, the theory is a metaphor that describes an event that comes as a surprise, has a major effect, and is often improperly rationalized after the fact with the benefit of hindsight. The term is based on an ancient saying that presumed black swans did not exist, a saying that became reinterpreted to teach different lessons after the first European encounter with black swans. With the theory, we cannot ignore a miracle or something bad that has changed history several times, but has never been included as an important factor in analyzing a phenomenon. So back to the question above about the possibility of World War III, my opinion is based on the above fact that 3 angels could avoid World War III. In the future, other angels may still be needed to prevent a nuclear war. On the other hand, it's enough one demon to push the apocalypse due to nuclear war. Next, please. Professor Kishore Mahbubani, a Singaporean career diplomat and an academic, provide a systematic and interesting explanation of why U.S.-China relation is in tension. The main factor is that U.S. does not want and is not ready for the rise of China as a superpower. So the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s made the U.S. very confident that U.S. was the only superpower. This is represented by the publication of Francis Fukuyama. The title is The End of History and the Last Man, released 1992. The book describes the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. So according to Kishore, there were two important moments that changed the U.S. position in which both events occurred in 2001. The first was 9/11, which forced the U.S. to focus on policies to deal with terrorism and be actively involved in the Middle East, like intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. Second is China's entry into the WTO, which means the injection of hundreds of millions of workers from China in the world market system. The map of single hegemonic hyperpower changed with the subprime mortgage economic crisis that started in America and spread to the global recession of 2008-2009. One of the factors causing the crisis was the high trade deficit of America against China, which increased 3 times. So in 2000, the deficit is around 83.8 billion. And in 2007, the deficit was 258.5 billion. So the deficit continued to increase, which caused the U.S. under President Trump to apply high tariffs on imported products from China. It was retaliated by China and caused, as we know, as a kind of the U.S.-China trade war. And the era of President Biden, within 6 months after the inauguration, his priorities are related to 4 issues: handling the COVID-19 pandemic, the economy, climate change, and addressing racial injustice. Meanwhile, the issue of strategic competition between the US and China, which had been taking place in the era of President Trump in the form of the hard position against China, was also continued. But not only in the government, even in the Congress, they also support the hard position against China. So in June 8, 2021, with the bipartisan U.S. Senate, Democratic and Republican parties, they passed called USICA, the United States Innovation and Competition Act of 2021. USICA has a broad scope, including containing the Strategic Competition Act of 2021 and the Meeting China Challenge Act 2021 regarding China's counter-threat policy on U.S. basic values and national security, as well as containment policy toward China through increasing cooperation with U.S. friends in the economic, social, and geopolitics area. So before the keynote speaker says about the pivot to Asia, maybe in that context, President Biden will continue President Obama policy pivot Asia. So tense U.S.-China relations could turn into open conflict in the South China Sea, SCS theater. I think the South China Sea, the SCS consists of the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands, where there is overlapping claims between China, Taiwan, and Vietnam in Paracel Islands, and China, Taiwan, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei in Spratly Islands. There are 3 reasons why the U.S. considers the SCS to be part of U.S. national interest. One, economic interests, where the SCS is the busiest and the most important sea lane in the world. Second, defense interests. The US has allies and friends in the Asia Pacific in the context of the containing China. In addition, the US 7th Fleet transit in to allied country through the SCS region. The interest number 3 is the creation of the balance of power. The US doesn't want China to dominate and annoy US friends and in the South China Sea. So we have to be careful because the escalation of tension in the SCS continues to increase, and it is feared that it could create an open US-China conflict. For example, in mid-April 2021, the 2 US and China militaries held a power exhibition show-off in the SCS region. The aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt and the amphibious assault ship USS Makin Island held military exercise in the SCS between 9 to 14 April. Meanwhile, the aircraft carrier Liaoning entered SCS waters in 11 April.
I hate to interrupt you, but you have about 1 minute to conclude your.
Okay. So next, please, the slide. The last one. Indonesia has advanced position to the actively involved in order to ease tension in the SCS. So Indonesia has entered door to do actively in how to manage to ease the tension. So the collaboration between Bakamla, the Indonesian Coast Guard, and U.S. Coast Guard in establishing maritime training center in Batam. So we have the opportunity that Indonesia can invite China to do the same and do for dialogue between China and US, invite all the claimants and use the training center cooperation with US and cooperation with China. The other one is about we have another door because the appointment of Ambassador Kim as the US ambassador, as well as the special envoy for the North Korea. So we do the same like when Indonesia successfully carried out the Cambodian peace mission with the Jakarta Informal Meeting. So we can invite from US and North Korea, invite also China to trying to find the solution about the North Korea. So with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pateo. Pateo has given us an outline of, in the beginning of the presentation, Pateo outlined what Yuval Noah Harari mentioned as the 3 global challenges to the humanity and to our world in the next couple of decades, which are climate change, technological disruption, and nuclear war. And he continued by explaining about the regulations on nuclear war and also the regulation and international law on weapons of mass destruction in chronological order. And he also talked about the mutually assured destruction concept, which has prevented great powers from just destroying each other for the past decades. So he also mentioned nearing the end of his presentation that the great power rivalry, which is exemplified by the US-China dynamics in the past few years, has one flashpoint, which is South China Sea. And South China Sea is something that is really close to us, and that presents a fact for Indonesia to play a strategic role amidst the US-China rivalry. Thank you so much, Pateo, for your very insightful presentation. Finally, we have our last speaker, which is Dr. Ali Wibisono, MA. He is a lecturer at the Department of International Relations at Universitas Indonesia and also the Vice Director of the Postgraduate Program at the International Relations Department at Universitas Indonesia. Selamat siang, Bapak Dr. Ali.
Selamat siang, Angelo. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Pak. I will continue your introduction for just a little bit more.
Okay.
Mr. Wibisono received his Master's of Arts and PhD in Politics and International Relations from the University of Nottingham and the United Kingdom. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Ali Wibisono, MA.
Thank you, Moderator. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank FPCI Universitas Indonesia for holding this discussion. I can see some of my students in the committee. I used to see my students in the international security class and non-traditional security class. So it's really proud to see you guys here. Good job. Keep up the good work. Also, I'd like to thank Professor Sedamir, Dr. Davis, and His Excellency Pak Satrio Nugroho for providing us with important information in your presentations. So I'm very sorry I do not write up dedicated slides here. But I really just want to follow up on some of the views that have been expressed by previous speakers. So let me iterate my argument in the beginning that it is worthwhile to pursue an arms control agreement with China. However, New START is not or should not be the only game in town. It should not be the only available avenue of arms control talks between US and China, particularly between US and China. We should be open to other channels of dialogue. We have to bear in mind in the beginning that a state that acquire a nuclear weapon wish to have a strategic capability with its nuclear weapon. Nuclear weapon is a strategic weapon in a sense that it is capable of debilitating an enemy state's capability to wage war. So, most particularly to my students here, imagine if state A has an enemy state B, and that state A has a weapon system that is capable to debilitate state B's capability to wage war against state A, then that state A has achieved a strategic objective. It can do whatever it wants to state B, short of having a joint military operation against itself. So it is the thinking of having a nuclear weapon is like that. So having a nuclear weapon system, it's not as simple as acquiring warheads. So it is useless to have hundreds or even thousands of warheads if those warheads cannot be delivered effectively. It is useless to be able to deliver the warheads, but it cannot penetrate missile defense system. And the warhead failed to detonate. So all of these capability established a deterrent capacity and the credibility of deterrence of the weapon system. So far, China has rejected joining a trilateral arms control negotiation with the US and Russia, but China is keeping other arms control options open. Beijing's suspicion about the US sincerity to pursue cooperative arms control is probably unlikely to change in the near term. But really, this means that the two sides, Washington and Beijing, has to continue exploring potential ways to engage. Arms control is important
contain the severity of strategic competition between China and the US. It will not delete the strategic competition itself, but it reduce the possibility of that competition resulting in a nuclear war. At the same time, arms control can actually also reduce the economic burdens of defense spending for both countries in the aftermath of global pandemic and probably one of the worst economic recession the world has ever seen. Now, it's probably good to bear in mind as well that just to neutralize the probably some exaggeration that China's interests in terms of military competition with the US is to achieve military superiority over the US and its allies, not globally, at least not in the short, medium term, not globally, but only in and around the West Pacific region. More specifically, East China Sea, and more particularly, the first island chain containing Okinawa and Taiwan. It is the maritime military competition in this region between Beijing and Washington, and as Beijing acquired military prowess in maritime sector, particularly in this region, that instigated and maintained military competition between Beijing and Washington. Washington has every interest, on the other hand, to keep the ability to operate effectively in this area. So arms control can ensure that conventional means non-nuclear, military competition does not become too costly and undermine people's safety, and that both powers must to reduce risks of hot war. And if that hot war ever happens, to prevent it from escalating to the use of nuclear weapons. So the first thing that has to be considered when we want to establish some dialogue or arms control between US and China is management of capabilities. I think Dr. Davis already at length explained to us. I think in his slides he also referred to Christensen from Federation of American Scientists, which estimate that China has a total stockpile of some 350 nuclear warheads, total stockpile. But out of these 350, about 272 are for delivery. And then in terms of delivery system, it has Triad. It has the land-based ballistic missiles, about 240 of land-based ballistic missiles, 48 sea-based ballistic missiles, and 20 gravity bombs. The gravity bombs are dumb bombs, unguided, only by gravity, assigned to bombers. So the remaining 78 warheads are for armed additional land and sea-based missiles that are in process of being fielded. I think this pales in comparison to U.S. inventory of 5,800 nuclear warheads. However, out of that 5,800, only 3,800 for delivery. By delivery by missiles and aircraft. The U.S. has about 800 missiles and aircraft. Overall, the United States is in compliance with the U-START treaty limit, so it's not so difficult to predict its capability. The limits cap the deployed strategic launchers at 700. Strategic launchers can be land-based, submarine, or heavy bombers. But China also pursues modernization of delivery capabilities. I think that in my reading, it has, and Dr. Davis also explained it, it has continued to field the DF-26. Its DF-26 ballistic missile is a dual capable. It can be used, it can use nuclear or non-nuclear warhead. And it's also in the early stage of fielding the DF-41. DF-41 is a new hit in town. It's a road mobile ICBM that is capable of carrying multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. Now, again, I'm probably talking to my students here. I probably haven't explained MIRV at any length in the class, but we look at China's MIRV program. It's interesting because the MIRV missiles, one missile is loaded with about probably 3 warheads. Some say there are 10 warheads, but I prefer to be conventional. 3 warheads in one missile, but not all of these warheads are to be detonated. Only one is to be detonated. Others are intended for decoys and penetration aids. So, so what are we looking at? We're looking at asymmetry of capabilities. Asymmetry makes an agreement like New START that limits only nuclear weapons hard to achieve. Asymmetry of capability means that proportional reductions between 2 states or a Chinese commitment to cap its nuclear arsenal in return for US nuclear reductions are not very promising. Parity between China and the United States, this is an outcome that Beijing could actually accept, but would be unacceptable for Washington. On the other hand, modest reductions by the United States will not reduce China's sense of vulnerability. What China worries the most in the context of US-China nuclear conventional military competition is the survivability of its nuclear weapons, its deterrent capability. China worries the most about America's preemptive nuclear or non-nuclear attacks. In the event of this kind of attack, it needs to have some of its nuclear weapons survive. And for those survived nuclear weapons to actually penetrate US anti-missile defense system. Yeah. So I'm looking at a possibility for at least talks on these kind of technicalities. There should be some mutual reassurances between China and US regarding US missile defense system. China has to have reassurance regarding US missile defense system, and the US must have reassurance regarding the transparency of Chinese nuclear forces. A possibility should be explored to conduct some kind of joint study on the missile defenses between the US and China's government experts, how to make US missile defense dedicated more to intercept North Korean ballistic missiles, but not Chinese ballistic missiles. I don't know, because the US missile defense is also targeted at North Korean ballistic missiles. Exploration should be made by US on technological and deployment options that could help minimize the impact on Chinese strategic nuclear forces. In return for US willingness to tackle the issue of missile defense, China should be willing to consider greater nuclear transparency. As China's nuclear forces have been more diversified and mobile, their survivability has become less dependent on secrecy about their exact numbers. Thus Beijing should be able to shed more light on the overall size of its nuclear arsenal and its modernization plans. Secondly, I think we have to take into account that both China and the United States are space exploring nations. Their military assets, including missile defense and rocket forces, are space related. And therefore, arms control involving China must also include arms control in outer space. Now, one of the concerns that drives China's production of fissile materials is US advanced space-based sensors that is capable to detect and track China's nuclear weapons and help the US execute first strike if it is justified to do so. US space-based sensors help its missile defense to nullify China's nuclear deterrent and drive China to eventually to drive it to increase its nuclear arsenals. US might have renewed interest in developing space-based interceptors, reminding Beijing of the Strategic Defense Initiative, a program under Ronald Reagan in the 80s that sought to defend the US against all ballistic missile threats. Such a program could pose a profound threat to China's arsenal, which is much smaller than the Soviet Union was in the 80s. So for 2 decades, China has refused to give up the options to produce more weapon-grade fissile materials because of its concern of the US superior space capabilities. So any arms control talks should integrate nuclear and outer space arms control efforts. In return, China should consider offering more self-restraint on the development of its nuclear capabilities. US could provide greater transparency on programs of most concern to China, space-based missile defense interceptors, reusable spacecraft, which generates concern about cutting-edge US surveillance and attack technologies, low Earth orbit, small satellite constellations, which make the Chinese worry that there are numerous satellites flying over their territory, carrying military sensors and weapons. So greater transparency could help contain threat inflation, which is a serious problem within Chinese expert community. And in return, as I said before, China should consider offering more self-restraint. Beijing could adopt a clear moratorium on fissile material production, even if determining the limits, quantitative limits on China's nuclear forces will be politically challenging. So we have to start with small steps, I guess. Thirdly, there is a need to address strategic and weapon system, whether nuclear or non-nuclear, simultaneously. In terms of warheads, China's possession of warheads is well below United States. But in terms of launchers, this is different. Launchers are not that different. The number of launchers that China has is not that low compared to the United States. The two countries should explore the possibility of an arms control agreement that places a single limit on land-based launchers of missiles with ranges greater than 500 kilometers. Ballistic missile launchers and heavy bomber, regardless of whether these systems are armed with nuclear or non-nuclear warheads. So again, we talk about launchers, not the missiles, not the warheads, but the launchers of missiles. This approach would simultaneously mitigate Chinese concerns about the United States' first strike capability, and as well as U.S. concern about China's regional military capability. And then, as Dr. Davis has also explained, there's an issue of entanglement between nuclear and non-nuclear military technologies. Dual capable missile systems, which can carry either nuclear or conventional warheads, could exacerbate risks of escalation during conventional conflicts, as the target country might be unable to determine or might wrongly determine whether it was under nuclear attack or conventional attack. Conversely, if a country's dual-capable missiles were loaded with nuclear warheads and attacked by conventional weapons, policymakers would also face a difficult choice between launching conventional or nuclear retaliation. So the two countries, China and the US, could hold kind of bilateral exchanges on what measures each government is taking to address the problem. For example, China should consider publicly declaring or communicate to the US the war type to reduce ambiguity about whether it can be armed with nuclear warheads, conventional warheads, or both. The US should explain its thinking about how to address the warhead ambiguity around its dual-use bombers. And if it deploys nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missiles in the future over any ships or submarines that carry nuclear and conventional cruise missiles. Another issue related to the technological side of the nuclear weapon is the cost and benefit of launch under attack posture. A launch under attack posture is maintaining nuclear forces on high alert, so missiles can be launched after incoming nuclear attack is detected, but before enemy warheads have detonated. So it's the time between launch and detonation. At the moment, China has reportedly kept nuclear warheads and land-based.
I hate to interrupt you, but you have 1 minute to conclude your presentation.
Yeah. So it has planned to ride out an attack before retaliating. But now, in some Chinese analysts view that launch under attack is militarily useful. And the US practice of maintaining this option for itself is an important inspiration for Chinese thinking. So I think that future arms control talks should consider its policy of maintaining the launch under attack posture option, with China should refrain from adopting such a posture itself. Lastly, how to pave the way towards an arms control. This is, I think, right now there's a lot of skepticism within the Chinese policy community about the value of pursuing arms control with the US. And I think this stems from lack of experience in negotiating and implementing arms control agreement. And I think it will be helpful if the US could start a dedicated engagement program with China on arms control verification. Chinese experts have two concerns about verification: whether verification can detect and deter cheating by the more technologically advanced party, and whether verification would enable espionage. The US could invite Chinese officials and experts to observe mock inspections, for example, such as those conducted to train US inspectors for New START. Such firsthand experience would help China determine whether a robust verification regime could address cheating concerns while protecting legitimate military secrets between two parties that do not actually trust each other. Last but not least, right political environment. Starting US-China arms control cooperation requires the right political environment. It is politically unacceptable to Chinese leaders if they are seen to agree to start arms control talks under US pressure. As a result, nothing can happen while the bilateral political relationship remains highly confrontational. Even after the political atmosphere calms, the US government needs to show its genuine interest in pursuing mutually beneficial cooperation, as Beijing is still deeply skeptical of America's motives in calling for China to engage with arms control. I will end with that quote, with that note. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bapak Ali Wibisono, for your presentation. For the past 25 minutes or so, we have heard from Bapak Ali Wibisono on America's and also China's behavior vis-a-vis the West Pacific versus in the world. And also, he also noted the fact that having an international norm regulating arms race, especially between great powers such as US and China, will be a very challenging task for each and every one of states in the world. And he also outlined the risk and possibilities of having a risk of having a arms race control. And also in the last leg of his presentation, he actually explained and elaborated on his thoughts and the prospects of US-China arms controls and what kind of behaviors are expected from both parties. Thank you very much, Bapak Ali Wibisono, for your very insightful presentation. We will continue for the next 25 minutes with a question and answer session, where all participants are allowed and encouraged and invited to ask questions to be answered by our speakers. So as you may have noted before, you may do this by send a message in the Zoom chat feature using the format name-institution-intended speaker-your question. But before that, I'd like to kick off our Q&A session with a couple of questions that have been prepared by the committee, which could heat up our discussion before we move on to the interactive question and answer session. But I really want each of the speakers to give a brief answer and explanation to each of these questions so that we can quickly move on to the interactive Q&A session. I'll go first to Dr. Davis. Dr. Davis, in your opinion, or factually speaking, are there any actions taken by international organizations like the United Nations which are aimed at resolving the nuclear arms race between great powers? Or do you think that international organizations such as the United Nations are more idle in responding to this arms race?
Thank you, Angelo. Look, I think there's always discussions and debates going on at the UN. And obviously the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is important in that regard as a global effort through the UN to try and keep the arms race from spiraling out of control. And ultimately its goal is nuclear disarmament. But I think we need to look at what's happening in the UN with a degree of skepticism, for the simple reason that the UN as an organization has sort of like understandably big idealistic goals for global peace and stability. And so therefore I've done an awful lot with the UN, for example, on space security and UN General Assembly Resolution 7536 on responsible behavior in space. And there's this mindset that they talk for years and years and years. And in the meantime, the strategic environment is deteriorating rapidly, or military technology is changing rapidly, and particularly in the space domain where you're seeing rapid emergence of counter-space capabilities and anti-satellite weapons that are completely outpacing the pace of the dialogue in the UN. So there is effort underway in the UN, and I think it's commendable, and it obviously needs to happen. But the actual hard work in terms of achieving arms control agreements that actually reduce warheads and missiles and delivery systems and launches is occurring at a bilateral level between the US and Russia. As we all know, nothing at the moment is happening between the US and China. And I think our discussion tonight is really about what should happen between the US and China. But the UN can play a supporting role, but I'm incredibly dubious and skeptical that it will ever take the lead role in coming up with a complete disarmament of nuclear weapons as is required by the NPT. I don't see that happening at all. These weapons were created, the genie is out of the bottle, we have to live with them and manage them as best as we can.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. We will go back to you during the interactive question and answer session because I've seen a lot of questions directed to you. The next question, I will direct this question to Bapak Ali Wibisono. How do you see, how does China's new build nuclear posture impact its image vis-a-vis the international community, especially in regards to China's economic, social, and political images? And in light of that, how does this expansion of nuclear capability related to China's ambition under its Belt and Road Initiative and other foreign policy initiatives?
Okay, thank you. The history of China's nuclear power capability is superpower-centric competition with Soviet Union and the United States. So in the beginning, it was there's this lean to one side policy from Mao to Soviet Union, and because of that, China received help for establishing its own nuclear power. And then beginning in the 60s, their relationship deteriorates, and I think beginning after 1969 border war, a rapprochement with the U.S. begins, and but then after the fall of Soviet Union, the United States is a more important enemy than Soviet Union. So partners of China's Belt and Road Initiative understood, I think, that China's nuclear weapons is a means of military competition with United States and Russia. So this superpower-centric competition is in mind, rather than other countries that is and especially not the BRI partners. So of course, BRI partners, including Indonesia, benefited from certainty of the global order, and certainty of global order is contributed by the certainty that nuclear war or escalation of nuclear arms race will not happen. But BRI partners are capable of differentiating between economic and military competition, because military competition is, especially nuclear military competition, is very much with the US. For BRI partners, it's more like the issue is more about the presence of Chinese economic power that usurps the partners' capability to have an independent economic development.
Thank you, Bapak Ali Wibisono. Next, for the next question, I will go to Professor Chedomir Nasirovic. Professor, let me go to you for the next question. The question is very succinct and it's very short. Are we in Cold War 2.0?
Very good question. So for me, I have lived in the Cold War when I was in Europe. So I'm old enough in order to remember this time. So I would say that the kind of war that we have today is a little bit different because the channels of communication and the channels of economy still exist between them, in the sense that during the Cold War, there were no communications, especially between people and businesses. But today, and since I'm coming from a business school, we can look at the supply chains, and the supply chains between the United States and China are extremely vibrant. So even if President Trump used to ask American companies to go back to the United States, they didn't do it. They are still staying there. So, and even if many of those companies have implemented the strategy, which is called China Plus One, that is to have another base in order to produce and not only to have China, even with this, they're still present in China. So it means that contrary to the old Cold War, when there were no communications, now we have so many communications, especially coming from the private sector in terms of individuals and in terms of companies, that it is very hard to compare. And the second thing, and I will stop there, the Cold War, the old Cold War, was an ideological war, when we used to have two ideologies, capitalism versus communism. And I don't see an ideological war right now because China doesn't want to export communism. And when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, it is not something which is permitting them to export an ideology. They are using other goals for that, but not from the ideological point of view. So from these two perspectives, I wouldn't see that it is a Cold War 2.0. It may be another type of war, but the term Cold War, I think, should not be appropriated there.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your answers. Now, the last question prepared by the organizing committee will be directed to Pateo. Pateo, what do you think is the outlook of our world in light of China's new nuclear posture? Do you think it is more of an optimistic outlook, or do you think it's more of a pessimistic outlook?
Interesting question. As I mentioned before, if we base on the history, the possibility of, because to maintain that the nuclear using nuclear weapon is too complex, but only a few people can use it. Meaning that if the commander, like I mentioned before, in the submarine commander, and actually the SOP for the nuclear button put the authority to the president, and as the highest level. But in the reality, many commanders has the same authority, and the problem about the communication and the malfunction system, like as I mentioned before. So still there is a threat that the World War III happen with the nuclear war. So I think we need more angels, as I mentioned before. But in general, people trying to more put aside to use the nuclear. Bilaterally, I think, like Israel now, they possess the nuclear, but they never trying to bluffing with they use the nuclear, but still the possibility of nuclear war we cannot just put aside. Thank you.
Thank you, Pateo. So for the first question in the interactive question and answer session, I will give the floor to Jonathan Jordan. Jonathan Jordan, are you available to talk? I'd like to invite you to unmute yourself if you are available. Otherwise, I will help to ask this question. So the question from Jonathan Jordan is directed to Dr. Davis. I will read the question as follows. In the US-Russia-China triangle, one of the main developments is how Russia is helping China to install its nuclear arsenal, modernize China's air force, and even give sensitive and high technology to China, which may even surpass China's in the future, which may even surpass Russia's in the future. Does Russia fear making China powerful, given it could undermine Russia's strong influence in Eurasia, especially in Central Asia region, and given memories of the Sino-Soviet split, especially with Russia now also trying to build strategic stability dialogue with US after the Biden-Putin summit in Geneva? And is this Russia's way of trying to limit China's influence in the global strategic triangle of power? Dr. Davis.
Thanks, Angelo, and thanks, Jonathan, for a good question. We shouldn't overemphasize just how much Russia is helping China at the nuclear level. They are helping China establish a space-based missile early warning capability that would enhance the survivability of their nuclear forces and actually make it possible for the Chinese to move towards a counterforce posture and a launch on warning posture. So that's something the Russians are doing, but they're not actually helping the Chinese to modernize their nuclear forces per se. The Chinese are doing that all by themselves. And so what you're seeing with the modernization of their ICBMs and the development of the ballistic missile submarines and the bombers are all originating in Beijing. They're not coming out of Moscow. Having said that, I think you'd raised an important question in the sense that in the same way that China has to watch what Russia is doing with its rapid nuclear modernization and watch what the Americans may do with their nuclear modernization in coming years, the Russians have to watch what the Chinese and the Americans are doing as well. So this is the point I was making earlier, that a trilateral, triangular strategic stability relationship is really challenging and potentially unstable. And that's what makes arms control really difficult. It's easier to do it bilaterally, but when you had a third party in, it becomes inherently unstable because that third party is not only balancing against Russia, the third party being China, it's not only balancing against Russia, but also the US, but each one is balancing against the other. And there's adversarial relationships between Moscow and Beijing against the United States. And so the US has to balance against both. So I do think that in terms of the Russians and what they think of the Chinese, I think the Russians do worry about the Chinese, overtaking them militarily, particularly Russia's ability to maintain control of its Far East military districts. Siberia is pretty sparsely populated and there's an awful lot of resources up there. And it's often said that if you were going to fight a nuclear war, particularly with tactical nuclear weapons, and Siberia is one place you could do it and get away with it because there's so few people up there. So I do think the Russians are worried about the Chinese and how quickly they're modernizing. But they have to watch the Americans too. And it's a complex business. I don't think it's at all straightforward or simple. And so I'm just trying to read your question, see if there's anything else I haven't covered. As for Russia-US relations, well, let's see what happens. The relationship is not very good at the moment, with the Russians aggressively using cyber attack on the US on an almost weekly basis. I don't necessarily see arms control between the Russians and the US really going anywhere anytime soon.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. So the next question is from Christopher. The question is directed to Professor Nesterovic. I'd like to check with Christopher if he's available now. Christopher.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, do you want to deliver your question directly to Professor Nesterovic?
Okay, sure. Bonjour, Professor Nestorovic. So I would like to ask the question, it's about the UK's aircraft carrier. So as has been mentioned, the UK is sending its aircraft carrier to the South China Sea. I was wondering if the UK has done so out of its own interest, especially since, the UK has gone out of the EU after Brexit, or are they doing it by being subservient to US interests? I would like to know. Thank you.
Very good question. So we don't have, I would say, a straightforward answer for this. I would just explore the two options. So the two options is, the first one is that they are aligning with the United States. So now they're not members of the European Union anymore, so they don't need to cooperate or to coordinate with the other European countries. So they are going back to the Atlantic, let's say, cooperation that they have with the United States. And we can consider that probably there is a demand coming from the United States that they are coming to the South China Sea or to the Taiwan Strait in order to have this kind of exposure, in order to show to China that the United States is not alone. And the United States is not alone because the United States also mobilized another country, which is very close, which is Japan. And you have observed that Japan has changed drastically his attitude recently concerning the situation in Okinawa, in Taiwan, or in some other places, even concerning Hong Kong and the other, let's say, internal affairs of China. And it is showing that the traditional allies of the United States are showing assertiveness. And this is something which is quite new because we were not used to have this kind of attitude, especially coming from Japan. And the second thing is that the UK can act on its own. I'm going back to the situation of Hong Kong because the UK is very sensitive to what is happening in Hong Kong. We have also observed that there is some kind of exodus of people from Hong Kong who are not happy with the situation happening there, and they are looking for the relocation to the United Kingdom. And it might also have some influence concerning the attitude of the UK there. So probably there is a combination of both. That is a demand coming from the United States, but also a genuine interest from UK to act on its own there. The UK cannot act on its own alone against China, but this kind of, I would say, alliance between the United States, UK, Japan, and probably Australia very soon may show to China that there is an alliance in front of the country rather than to have only two countries vying for supremacy, United States and China.
Thank you, Professor. Christopher, while you're here, why don't you stay for a bit? And I'd like to invite other participants to also actively ask questions to our speaker. I think we can accommodate like one or two more questions. But yeah, Christopher, while you're here, why don't you ask the second question to Dr. Davis?
Okay, thank you. Dr. Davis, I would like to ask a question, if you don't mind. So it's about, would it be reasonable to perhaps sign a treaty with China on the basis of removing the THAAD meaning the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Missiles in Korea? Because I'm guessing if we do something like this, it would be somewhat akin to the US agreeing to remove its missiles in Turkey in exchange for the Soviet Union not setting up the missiles in Cuba during the Cold War. So is that realistic?
Well, I think there are two different types of capability. The Jupiter missiles in Turkey were offensive ballistic missiles. They were medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles designed to deliver nuclear warheads into the Soviet Union. THAAD is a defensive system. It's designed to shoot down ballistic missiles that are launched from North Korea. So it's a completely different situation in that regard. And I think that it's important that the THAAD system remains in place because the moment you start withdrawing military systems under Chinese pressure, that pressure will just increase for more concessions. And at the same time, you're weakening South Korea and Japan's security in the face of not only North Korean nuclear threats, but also Chinese nuclear threats as well. So I wouldn't advocate withdrawing THAAD. I think they need to remain in place. And if anything, given how rapidly the North Korean missile capabilities are developing, probably need to be expanded as well. Chinese won't like that, but the US has to make decisions based on its national security interests and the interests of its key allies in the region. If it doesn't, if it simply gives concessions, then the demands for more concessions are not going to stop. I'll also take the liberty of adding on some thoughts about the UK carrier battle group. I think what's happening in the Indo-Pacific region is the establishment of a coalition of like-minded countries to deter China, particularly in the context of Taiwan. And the reason why the UK have deployed that carrier is because they want to send a strong message to China that the UK will not sit back and essentially do nothing in the face of a Chinese move against Taiwan. Everyone is very concerned about the prospect in the next few years, within this decade, of a Chinese military move against Taiwan. We take it incredibly seriously. And we're starting to, shall we say, prepare for that contingency in terms of military capability development. That's happening in Australia. The 2020 Defence Strategic Update, our latest white paper, was focused almost exclusively on preparing for that contingency. So we do take it incredibly seriously, and in that sense, the ability of like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific, including the UK, to work together to deter that scenario, I think is a really important one.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. For all participants, unfortunately, Bapak Ali Wibisono had to hop off from the meeting because of internet connection, but don't worry. Thank you so much, everyone. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of the question and answer session, and we would like to thank you, all the participants who have eagerly submitted their questions, as well as our speakers who have answered them and shared with us their insights. We have started today's event with a very interesting kickoff from Professor Chedomir Nestorovic on the great power dynamics. Also, it was followed by a very interesting presentation from Dr. Davis on China's nuclear ambition, and also the recent development in arms race, and also the new START treaty. And also, we have also heard from Bapak Theo about the efforts of the international community in creating regulations and in regulating essentially nuclear arms race. And also, our last speaker, Bapak Ali Wibisono, has beautifully wrapped up our discussion with some of the key policy directions that he outlined during his presentation. And with that, thank you so much once again to all participants. And I, Angelo Wijaya, will be signing off as the moderator of today's event. And I will hand back the event to the Master of Ceremony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Angelo, for moderating this amazing and insightful discussion. We hope that all the participants here can get many fruitful insights and gain more knowledge regarding China's nuclear ambition in the context of the new START treaty extension. We would like to remind all of our participants today to fill the attendance form through the link that has been shared by the committee in the Zoom chat feature to claim the certificate of appreciation for all the participants. Next, as we have mentioned before, we will announce the best participant of FPCI Chapter We World in Snap Webinar 2, a new nuclear arms race, China nuclear ambition in the context of the new START treaty extension. All right, so without further ado, the best participant award goes to Congratulations, Christopher Tito, for being the best participant in the event. Thank you, Christopher Tito, for the great question and for actively being involved in today's discussion. Christopher Tito's question was regarding the possibility of ratifying treaty with China on basis of removing THAAD and the question on UK interest in sending its aircraft carriers in the South China Sea. The next best participant goes to, yes, congratulations, Jonathan Jordan, for also a very great question in today's discussion. Jonathan Jordan's question was regarding Russia's intention on modernizing China military capabilities, including its nuclear arsenal, and pointing also to recent US-Russia dialogue. The best participant will be contacted by the committee for the handover of the certificate. All right, so now we will have a quick photo session, which will be documented by Kenneth from the Public Relations Division. So for all the speakers and participants, please turn on your camera so that we can capture your smile in today's wonderful event.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. There are currently 5 slides. To all participants, please turn on your cameras. I will give you a second to get ready. Okay, I will start by the first slide. Please hold your smile for a while, okay? 1, 2, 3. Second slide. 1, 2, 3. Third slide. 1, 2, and 3. Fourth slide. 1, 2, and 3. All right. Thank you. Okay, that's it. Thank you for everyone for attention. Now back to Dennis.
Thank you, Kenneth. This photo session marks the end of today's WINS webinar too. A big token of gratitude goes to all the speakers, Professor Chedemir Nestorovic, Dr. Malcolm Davis, Mr. Theodorus Satrio Nugroho, and Mr. Ali Abdullah Wibisono, PhD, as well as also the moderator, Mr. Angelo Abel Wijaya, and all the participants who have joined our webinar today. Please don't forget to follow our new website at fpciui.com, our social media at Instagram at FPCIui, Spotify and YouTube at FPCI Chapter UI, and Medium at fpci.ui, so that you won't miss our future works and publications. We sincerely await you in our future events. My name is Dennis Tahar, signing off as the Master of Ceremony. Please accept my sincere apologies if I made any mistake during the event. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Shanti 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 Om. Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, Chapter Universitas Indonesia, Board of 2021. Thrive with intelligence.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Once again, many thanks to our wonderful speakers for attending today. To Professor